Good day. Our topic for today is about history of psychological testing. Again, this is Donna Leia Buendia, and for today, we're going to continue our broad overview of the field of psychological testing and assessment with a look backward so that we could have a better appreciation to the historical context of the enterprise. Okay, so psychological testing is a field characterized by the use of samples of behavior in order to assess psychological constructs such as cognitive and emotional functioning about a given individual. We all know from our previous lecture that psychological testing is under psychological assessment process, wherein we're gonna use devices. It could be a paper and pencil form, or it could be in a computerized aided format, wherein we can measure different kinds of variables related to psychological aspects. Psychological tests also offer a formal way to measure traits, feelings, beliefs, and abilities that can lead to people's problems. Some tests assess the presence of certain conditions, that, for example, diagnostic tests, okay, uh, like depression, anxiety, anger control, or susceptibility to stress. All right, so let us now proceed with the history of psychological testing. Okay, so this is in accordance to the timeline of early milestones in the history of psychological testing. Okay, so the first known standardized test in 2200 BC is the Chinese Civil Service Examination. So, what are the fields that are being measured in this exam? It could be in the oral certification examination in music, archery, horsemanship, writing, math, public and private rights, and ceremonies. Okay? So during the Song or Sung dynasty in China, okay, which actually ran from 960 to 1279 CE, tests are emphasized knowledge of classical literature. So those test takers who demonstrated command of the classics were perceived as having acquired the wisdom of the past, and they are therefore entitled for government position. Okay, so during some dynasties as well, testing was virtually suspended, and government positions were actually given to family or friends, or simply being sold. So that is actually an ethical issue. Okay, during the history of psychological testing. Okay, it was also said that Chinese emperor examined his officials every third year to determine if they are fit for the office. Alright, so another important proponent in the field of the history of psychological testing is Wilhelm Wundt. So there was an assessment uh, of an important activity at the very first experimental psychology laboratory, okay, which is founded at the University of Leipzig in Germany by Wilhelm Max Wundt. He is also the one who used calibrated pendulum to measure the speed of thought. Okay. Um, Wilhelm Wundt is actually a medical doctor whose title at the university was actually Professor of Philosophy. So he and his students tried to formulate general description of human abilities with respect to variables such as reaction time, perception, and attention span. Okay, so one focus on how people were similar and not different. Okay, so in fact, he is the one who viewed individual differences Okay, so another important proponent is Francis Galton. So, in the course of his efforts to explore and quantify individual differences in people, he became an extremely influential contributor to the field of measurement. He also aspired to classify people according to their natural gifts and to ascertain their deviation from an average. Okay, so he would be credited with devising or contributing to the development of many contemporary tools of psychological assessment like questionnaires, rating scales, and self-report inventories. Okay, so continuation for the history of psych testing with regard to the contribution of Sir Francis Galton, who is considered to be a British genius. Okay, and he is actually the person who invented the first battery of tests, peculiar assortment. Okay, when you say a battery of tests, these are group, series, or set of several tests which are designed to be administered as a unit in order to obtain a comprehensive assessment of a particular factor or a certain phenomenon. Okay, so Gallon also administered the first test battery to thousands of citizens at an international health exhibit. Okay, so he also introduced the first word association test to psychology. This is also known as a method for strategy, which is used in psychodynamic approach by Sigmund Freud. Okay, if you're familiar with that. So he used a list of 75 stimulus words with which he read and noted his responses. And then his responses to the words had a tendency to remain alike, and they were typically taken from his childhood experiences. Okay, so this prompted future studies by prominent psychologists such as Freud. Okay, the area of psychoanalysis. So this is what I am mentioning to you a while ago. Okay, so this is used in dealing with the unconscious mind and free association. Okay, so later I am going to give you an activity about word association technique, so you will be able to familiarize yourself with this one. Okay, so this is a picture of Sir Francis Galton. Okay. All right, so let me introduce to you Mr. James McKim Cattell. So he is an American psychologist, and he studied together with Galton. Okay, and in 1890, he proclaimed the modern testing agenda in his classic paper entitled Mental Tests and Measurements. He was tentative and modest when describing the purposes and applications of his instruments. Okay? He is also a founding member of the APA, or American Psychological Association, and he is also the organization's fourth president. So J.M. Cattell opens a testing laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania for leaving to Europe to teach in Cambridge. Okay, at Cambridge, he came in contact with Galton. Okay, and according to him, Galton is actually the greatest man that he ever known. Okay, so because he was inspired with his interaction with Galton, um, he coined the term mental test, right? So this is coined in the 1890 publication. Okay, so Cattell, more than any other person, was in this fashion responsible for getting mental testing underway in America. Okay, and it is plain that his motivation was similar to Galton's. Okay, and that he was influenced or at least reinforced by Galton. Alright, so he also became a professor and chair of the psychology department at Columbia University. Okay, so other students who won at Leipzig include Charles Spearman, Victor Henry, Emil Kraepelin, E.B. Titchener, and G. Stanley Hall, and Leiter Whitmer. Okay, so these are actually the proponents of psychology. So to be specific, in 1901, Clark Wissler discovered the Cattelian brass instruments test that have no correlation with college grades. Okay, in 1904, Charles Spearman describes his two-factor theory of mental abilities. So, first major textbook on education measurement, E.L. Thorndike's Introduction to the Theory of Mental and Social Measurement is being published. So, to continue the timeline of the history of psychological testing, in 1905, Binet and Simon invented the first modern intelligence scale, while Carl Jung uses word association test for analysis of mental complexes. Okay? In 1914, Stern introduced the intelligence quotient, or the IQ, okay, the mental age divided by the chronological age. Okay? So when you say chronological age, this is actually your age at the present. Okay? It might be different with the mental age because mental age is actually the mental capacity of that person in that certain age. Okay? In 1916, Louis German revises the Binet-Simon scale, and it was published as Stanford Binet. And then there are revisions that appear in 1937, in 1960, and 1986. In 1917, okay, so there are what we call the Army Alpha and Army Beta. So these are the first group of intelligence tests, and this is constructed and administered to the U.S. Army recruits. Okay, so Robert Woodworth developed the Personal Data Sheet, or the PDS, and first personality test. So the Army Alpha are intended for the literate Army, okay, and while the Army Beta are for those who are illiterate. In 1920, the Rorschach ink blot test is being published. So this is a kind of a projective test that uses ink blot to identify or distinguish the personality of the person. So in 1921, Psychological Corporation, okay, so this is the first major test publisher, was founded by Cattell, Thorndike, and Woodworth. In 1927, okay, the first edition of Strong Vocational Interest Test Interest Blank, okay, for men is being published. In 1938, the first Mental Measurements Yearbook is published. And in 1939, the Wechsler-Bellevue Intelligence Scale is published, and the revisions are published as well. And these are actually intended, okay, to measure IQ, okay, or the intelligence and cognitive ability of adults and older adolescents. In 1942, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory is published, or for short, this is the MMPI. So this is actually a psychological test that assess personality traits and psychopathology, and this is actually primarily intended to test people who are suspected of having mental health or other clinical issues. In 1949, Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or WIS, is published. Okay, so this is also a measure of intelligence among the children. Okay, and the revisions are also published in 1974 and in 1991. World War I had brought with it not only the need to screen the intellectual functioning of recruits, but also there's a need to screen the general adjustment for the recruits. So, Governmental Committee on Emotional Fitness, which is chaired by Robert S. Woodworth, okay, assigned a task of developing a measure of adjustment and emotional stability that could be administered quickly and efficiently. So let us now discuss the history of psychological testing in our own country, the Philippines. The history of psychological testing in the Philippines. So this is the timeline showing the history of how psychological testing developed in the Philippines. From 1901 to 1910, so as early as 1910, 2 years after the University of the Philippines was founded, psychology was being taught at the Department of Philosophy and Psychology College of Liberal Arts, and the department was placed under Dr. Henry S. Townsend. He is an American who taught all of the psychology courses being offered, namely general psychology, generic psychology, educational psychology, and test and measurement. From 1911 to 1920, psychology separated and it became a part of the College of Education when the college was created in 1918. So Mr. Townsend became acting head of this new department as he continued to be head of the Department of Philosophy at the College of Liberal Arts. So under the able leadership of Dean Francisco Benitez, he is the University of the Philippines modeled for the entire country the curricular utilization of psychology in education. In 1920 to 1930, the University of the Philippines Department of Psychology is established within the School of Education. Agustin Alonso is the chairman at the year of 1956. So the Department of Psychology at the University of Santo Tomas is established as well in 1930. From 1931 to 1940, Sinproso Padilla organizes the Psychological Clinic at the University of the Philippines at the year of 1932. Jesus Perpinan sets up the FEU Psychological Clinic in 1933, and Angel de Blas set up the Experimental Psychology Laboratory in the University of Santo Tomas in the year of 1938. In 1941 to 1950, Estefania Aldabalin set up the Institute of Human Relations at Philippine Women's University in the year of 1948. And for years 1951 to 1960, Joseph Gortz established the Psychology Department at the University of San Carlos in the year of 1954. Continuation, so for the year 1961 to 1970, Father Jaime Bulatao established the Department of Psychology and the Central Guidance Bureau at Ateneo de Manila University in the year 1961. The Philippine Psychological Corporation is also founded, and the corporation offers psychological services, and it became the main retailer of psychological tests. Moreover, the Psychological Association of the Philippines, or the PAP, was also founded in the year 1962. So it holds its first annual convention, leading to the first publication, Symposium on the Filipino Personality, in 1963. The Philippine Journal of Psychology became the official journal of the PAP, and it also makes its first appearance. So the PAP, together with the Philippine Association of the Social Workers, Philippine Economic Society, Philippine National Historical Association, Philippine Sociological Society, and the Philippine Statistical Association of the Philippine Social Science Council in 1968. Okay, so psychological testing flourishes as the overseas contract workers, which booms begins in the 1970s. In 1971 to 1980, the Pambanang Samahan ng Psikolohiyang Pilipino is founded by Virgilio Enriquez in the year 1975. Several universities in the Visayas and Mindanao established psychology departments, in 1975, and so on. In the year 1981 to 1990, the bill in the Batasang Pambansa that would require practicing psychologists to be licensed was introduced in the year 1982. 1991 to 2000, Alan B. I. Bernardo is awarded the National Research Council of the Philippines Achievement Award. So this is in recognition of his distinguished career as a prolific researcher and author, respected professor, and academic leader for original contributions to the field of cognitive science and special human problem solving, mathematical cognition, bilingual cognition, cultural and contextual factors in thinking and theories of intelligence, as well as applications of cognitive science to education, which has won for him prestigious national and international awards and fellowships for teaching and research, and for being a guiding light for young scholars and academics, thus ensuring the continued growth of psychology as a discipline. The PAP confirms the title of outstanding psychologists to 6 psychologists. So they are Betty Abrejana, Ana Daisy Javier Carlota, Noemi Catalan, Rosemary Salazar Clinenia, Elizabeth R. Ventura, and Inelda Virginia Villar. Okay, so listed here are some of the historical figures in psychological testing. Okay, we have Charles Spearman test theory, Frederick Kelly for achievement testing, Edward Thorndike achievement testing, Lewis Terman for intelligence testing, James McKim-Cattell intelligence testing, E.F. Lindquist for achievement testing, Herman Rorschach personality testing, E.K. Strong Jr. interest measurement, Arthur Otis intelligence testing, O.K. Burros for mental measurement, Benjamin Bloom achievement testing, David Wissler for intelligence, Stark Hathaway personality testing, Howard Gardner for intelligence testing, and Robert Sternberg for intelligence testing. Therefore, studying the history of psychology is important to understand how the study came into practice, where the belief comes from, why psychology is important, what scientists and other noted persons in history used to draw his or her conclusion from, and why the conclusion is relevant, and how the psychology evolves with society as time moves forward and society changes. This will also help us to gather data, okay, on how our psychological testing has evolved, transformed, developed. So this is very important, especially that we cannot arrive to what we have today without looking back at the previews or at the past. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any further questions, you can send me a message at psychologista.files@gmail.com.